presentation. I will be presenting today on African American youth body image erasure and young adult fiction, and more specifically, adaptive film. I like to start off with little anecdotes to contextualize what I'm talking about, so bear with me. As an undergraduate, I was a part of Big Brothers and Big Sisters. My 9-year-old mentee struggled with reading, so I had purchased this book that I thought she would like, and we would read it together. It was a fantasy book about a white girl, and as you can see from the cover. And she took one look at this book and put it down. She didn't want to read it because she felt that the girl on the cover didn't look like her. As an avid reader and writer, I was always cognizant of the fact that the main characters described or illustrated in books for young adults and teenagers, particularly in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, and paranormal romance, were disproportionately white. This cultural phenomenon, founded within the publishing industry, is but a mere microcosm of social normativity of the greater Western society. Black body erasure plays a pivotal role in how African American adolescents construct and perceive body image. Erasure, as it will be used in this context, does not simply refer to the complete invisibility of black bodies, but rather, erasure also occurs when the black body gains visibility but lacks complexity and development, or it becomes a tool to reinforce rather than challenge white privilege. Anthropologist Helen Page posits that African American imagery, particularly black male imagery, is portrayed in ways that strips blacks of complexity, and through such hegemony protects and keeps hidden white privilege. He writes, and I don't know why I thought Helen, I thought that was a girl, but it actually is a guy, so. He writes, for most media consumers, the media agency's routine defense of white privilege is masked. However, some consumers do closely examine black male imagery and see how it protects white privilege, end quote. From an anthropological perspective, I argue that the lack of ethnic diversity in young adult fiction and film, particularly in science fiction and fantasy genres, contributes to body image disturbances and possibly lower self-esteem among African American children. By reinforcing white privilege either through a complete omission of round, developed characters, and round characters we say in creative writing is characters with complex attributes. There are conflicting attributes involved in it, so they're not just these one-dimensional, unilateral type of characters. They have some complexity like us. And also, an inclusion of black characters whose only role is to act as what Jacqueline Force calls the black servant figure in her article titled African American Characters in White-Authored Post-Atomic Novels. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as my presentation progresses. So I have 3 major sections I want to cover. The first one discusses the complete omission of black characters in fantasy, particularly fairy tales, and how black parents wish to use their purchasing power, particularly black mothers, as leverage to increase black fictional representation. The second section examines the black servant figure in science fiction fantasy for adults. How young black readers respond to such figures is examined here. And the final section looks at the current challenges that black writers, particularly of science fiction and fantasy, face as they try to publish. And I conclude by elucidating the need for future interventions to increase black diversity within popular fiction and adaptive film. Can't talk about this without Disney. So. Gotta have it. All right. In the article, Seeing White, Children of Color, and the Disney Fairy Tale Princesses, Dorothy Hurley argues that the self-image of children is shaped by visual images conveyed through textual and digital mediums. In regards to Disney princesses, she writes, some researchers have indicated that children's literature, including picture books, plays a role in providing visual images to children that give them cultural information about themselves, about others, and the relative status of group membership. The implications that most, if not all, children, including children of color, see white as good, living happily after, and pretty are quite disturbing. And I would go as so far as to argue that the group membership does not necessarily have to refer to a specific culture, but can actually translate on a national, on a macrocosmic level to refer to how they see their status being negotiated within the global society, as well as specifically the national United States or American society. Although Hurley makes a cogent point that visual images in literature play a role in how many children construct their own self-image, it is important to note that for older children, this can occur without images. It can actually be evoked through text itself. And the text can allow the children to actually produce these mental images, which can play a role in their self-imaging. Moreover, 4 years after Hurley's article was published, Tiana became Disney's first African-American princess. So I guess we are missing one princess that I will talk about later, but we do have a black African-American princess. But just having this one black princess among a plethora of predominantly white princesses, although it might be a step towards increasing fictional character diversity, it's still, according to the African-American parents and children that I interviewed, is not quite enough to increase the numbers of rounded and complex characters in popular young adult fiction. So I'm making this distinction here between rounded, complex characters and these more fractured and flattened characters. And I think that what I want to try to argue here is that the flattened characters still do perpetuate this sense of black invisibility and black body erasure. So my ethnography was an initial attempt to explore this issue. So again, all feedback that you guys may provide on how to expand it, how to revise some things is more than welcome, because this is just an initial attempt at looking at this topic. And the ethnography itself actually included a total of 11 participants, so it was quite small and localized. Three of the participants were actually black women, particularly mothers, and four of the participants were actually children, minority children. And this composed my focus group component, which took place in Ocala, Florida. Does anyone know where that is? Oh, somebody. Yes.
Marion County. Marion County.
Okay, awesome. Yes, it's a small country mountain type of town, you know. But yeah, that's where I actually did my focus group component of my ethnography. However, 4 black writers were part of my online component of this ethnography. And these writers come from the Black Science Fiction Society. You can actually find their website online. And that's a coalition, international coalition of writers, illustrators, filmmakers, video game developers, animators, voiceover actors, musicians, the list goes on. But they all centralize their techniques and their crafts around fantasy, paranormal romance, thrillers, and of course science or speculative fiction. I'm a part of this society, and my EMIC or insider positionality granted me access to published writers who were willing to share their thoughts with me about the lack of diversity within young adult fiction. So I did want to get the writer's perspective in addition to the children themselves, as well as the parents and educators of children. So the focus group component, a little bit more tricky, had much more limitations for me as a researcher with an exploratory approach. For example, 2 of the African American women that I actually interviewed were mothers, and one was an aunt, and all of them were teachers. The second, yeah. Grad students sort of intimidated with that a little, but yeah. Anyway, the second focus group consisted of 3 African American boys and 1 boy who was Hispanic, and all were between the ages of 9 and 12, so they're in that mid-grade range, that young adult age range. And even though I was black and a woman, I still could see how I was considered in some instances to be the edict or the other by these groups. For example, unlike the black women I interviewed, I myself have not gone through the awesome and wonderful process, although I hear it's painful, called childbirth. I don't have any kids. And the second aspect of this too is that a lot of these women have been teaching for 7, 10, 13, 15 years and have been around young children a lot, whereas my only experience has been through volunteerism between the Big Brothers Big Sisters organization, as well as teaching as a volunteer instructor at an inner city school in Orlando, Florida for just creative writing. So there was a little bit of otherness that I too felt coming into this particular social cultural context. And the boys, however, I did feel a sense of otherness too with my gender. I definitely felt that the way that they answered some of the questions definitely was a little bit different. I think that they didn't want to hurt my feelings the way they felt about Twilight and different types of books that were catered toward women. I think that my gender definitely did inform or shape some way their responses. So a little bit of reflexivity there for those anthropologists. I definitely felt that my gender played a role in their responses. But another thing too is that the group that I interviewed, these boys, they loved to read. And the kids that I was exposed to through my volunteerism were actually kids that were in many ways disenfranchised. They didn't have parents that were teachers. They didn't have parents that had this major purchasing power to purchase these books for about popular fiction. And so I definitely felt a distinct difference in how I approach questions with these kids as opposed to the kids that I was trained to address certain types of disparities with through my creative writing. So, again, back to Tiana. During the group discussion among the black women I interviewed, Disney's first black princess became a point of interest. One of the women, who was the director of the Head Start program for children, said, "Who would have ever thought that we would have the first black Disney movie, The Princess and the Frog?" You know, a black princess, a real princess. It's becoming more relevant to show more of us in movies. Even in Disney movies, there needs to be a variety of characters. And another woman, before I can even ask my next follow-up question, quickly responded, "Because we go to Disney World and spend money just like they do." She never quite said who they was, but throughout the context, being able to contextualize it, she was definitely referring to mainstream society, the dominant society, particularly white American society. That was very explicit through her responses. So this transaction, I believe, is an exemplar of how there's a socio-economic power structure that intersects with race, which controls how fictional images are dispensed to the public, which in turn plays a role in how young adults engage and interpret those images. It further shows that black women recognize their consumer power in this structure and see the marginality of black fictional characters as an affront to that power. However, this concern becomes further complicated when such characters gain some level of visibility, when they assume the black servant figure archetype that I'll be discussing right now. Literary fiction and adaptive films like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Gone with the Wind both provide exemplars of the black servant figure. However, such a fictional character also has relevancy in today's science fiction and fantasy genres. According to Jacqueline Force, the black servant figure is not merely a servant. That's too easy. It also operates as a savant and even a savior to white characters. Specifically, in relation to the post-apocalyptic subgenre of science fiction, Force argues that black servant figures are characters that exhibit terrific skills and rare knowledge that save white lives. Their own needs for such support are emphatically downplayed or worse, denied through authoritatively enforced self-sacrifice, end quote. This characterization, Force contends, has historical underpinnings that harken to post-Civil War black and white labor relations. Reconstruction-era black laborers were enjoined, she writes, to spend their lives in compliant, poorly compensated services to former white masters, end quote. This historical parallelism is not only singular to the characters depicted in classical doomsday fictional works, but it permeates through the science fiction and fantasy adaptive films currently that's catering to children. There is a cultural phenomenon that I want to focus on for the remainder of this paper, in addition to looking at the writer's perspective, in today's young adult fantasy and science fiction, to change white, minor, sidekick characters found in books into ethnic characters once they appear on the big screen or in television. Although this is clearly an attempt to market to a multicultural viewing audience, I think it still recapitulates the white privilege sphere that black disenfranchised characters are operating within. For example, the international sensation, I had to go back to Twilight, has no ethnic minority characters in the actual book Saga, besides the Native American werewolf community. Go Team Jacob. Once this story is adapted for the big screen, the French vampire villain Laurent, I hope I said that right, I know it's French, he is described in the book as having dark hair and olive skin. But when he's shown on the big screen, he's clearly has some sort of transformation, right? Brother has hazel, brown-looking eyes, brown, dark skin, and these thick locks. So there's some transformation going on. This clearly wasn't the writer's intent. Another example is taken from the 1991 paranormal romance that actually precedes Twilight, which is called The Vampire Diaries, which was adapted for TV in 2009. How many of you guys watched Vampire Diaries? It's okay, don't mind. Okay. I do, I made my only one. All the characters in the book are white, again. However, the best friend of the main character is a witch. Her name is Bonnie, and she's described as being this very pixie-like girl with pale white skin and strawberry blonde hair. she's had a transformation as well. She becomes this black girl. She's black, and her African-American slave ancestry, rather than the Scottish ancestry that was so prevalent in the book, actually becomes a major central plot line within the actual TV series. So there is a sense of marketability that you see associated with transforming the race of these minor characters into these ethnic characters for television and film, but there is a trade-off associated with that that definitely ties into this whole notion of black body erasure. Because even though she's black, there's still some level of invisibility going on here. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So, this conversation couldn't be complete without briefly examining the role race or lack of plays in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Unlike the other authors, Rowling does make some sort of effort to integrate characters of different ethnicities into her works. For example, female non-white characters include Cho Chang, who's Chinese. You have the twins there at the lower right-hand corner, Parvati and Padma Patil, who are of East Indian origin. Angelina Johnson, the girl in the middle there, she was described in the book as being a black witch with braids or plaits, so this type of ethnic type of hairstyle associated with her race as well. And the boys that you see there are all black, and their names are Dean Thomas, Lee Jordan, and Blaze Sabini. And the central description used to describe them is not very heavy. In fact, it's almost virtually non-existent. But you do know that they're black because she says in like a line, "You're there, they're black." However, although racial diversity seems to abound in the Harry Potter books and films, this diversity is virtually absent among characters of authority. The topic of white authority in Harry Potter is taken up in Mikhail Lyubitsky's article, Harry Potter and the Word That Shall Not Be Named. He writes, "We really don't nor can't know anything about the reality of the non-white characters. To see racism, it is first necessary to see race. Yet Rowling's portrayal of race is problematic in that none of the white characters barely seem to exist nor occupy positions of authority." End quote. Lyubansky further argues how Rowling's description of half versus pure blood directly speaks to the historic oppression that blacks within the African diaspora, not just in the United States, experience, and the constant pervasive social taboo of interracial dating. However, I argue that this critical parallel becomes lost to young readers when race relations and issues of authority are carefully avoided by being tiptoed around. By color blindness driving much of the text, it actually perpetuates rather than counters black and other minority invisibility. While facilitating the boy-focused group component of my small ethnography, colorblindness thematically shaped much of the responses in regards to race, particularly in relation to the latest young adult fantasy series that was adapted into film called Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. In this book, Percy is a demigod son of Poseidon. His best friend Grover, who is actually a satyr, helps to protect him when he flees to Camp Half-Blood. Grover in the book is described as having brownish curly hair and white skin. However, in the movie, he becomes, like many of the supporting characters that I previously mentioned, a brother. Grover is the epitome of a black servant figure. Whereas Percy's hybrid state is a mixture of human and god, Grover lacks divinity, but rather his humanity becomes devalued by its hybridity and his hybridity associated with the animal-like attributes, particularly that of a goat. So whereas you see with Percy, his humanity is amplified by being half god, the brother here has a sense of devalued or animalistic association with him with the traditional satyr mythological creature. As we discussed Grover's transformative role from book to movie, one of the boys explained to me that his race doesn't matter because we all bleed red. However, he goes on to say, I think it is important for us to be in movies like that because somebody can look back and say, well, since he can do that, what makes me so different? I think this is an important statement to make. It demonstrates that a mass audience can never fully recognize sameness across racial lines if diversity in characterization is never shown equally in popular fiction adapted into film. So again, with Bonnie, with Grover, and with the other characters that I've mentioned, there seems to be some sort of transformative desire to make these characters ethnic, but they're still not on an even playing field with the masses of white characters that are out there. Very rarely will you see a main protagonist that is a Grover, that's a Bonnie, within science fiction and fantasy catering to young adults. So I argue that changing the face of white privilege by including black servant figures to appease and market to a multicultural viewing audience is still perpetuating white privilege. Moreover, the young boys that I interviewed, they did recognize the issue of black invisibility, particularly in fiction, and they still preferred to read books versus watching the films because they felt that books are more richer and nothing was chalked out. However, I asked the question, what about those minority children in Western society who do dislike reading? A 2009 national longitudinal study of youth analyzed by sociologist Kyung-Jin Lee revealed that ethnic differences persist in how poverty informs children's reading. His data analysis, I think, was quite intriguing. It revealed that 32% of black children live in poverty for more than 10 years, and only 3% of white children live in poverty for the same amount of period. And I think the most striking of his findings is that black children that have the same poverty level as white children score significantly higher on reading skills in the earlier years of their life, around 5 or 6 years old, but then something happens when they get older. Their reading skill level drastically decreases when they reach the ages of 11 or 12. So why is this important to our discussion about black body image erasure? Well, in 2002, the publishing industry had a boom in multicultural picture books, according to Michelle Martin's book, Brown Gold Milestones in African American Children's Books, 1845 to 2002. However, no boom in young adults or teen fiction has ever taken place. It is my belief that more research needs to be conducted to see if there is any type of connection to look at that triangulation of poverty, age, and racial marginality in young adult fiction to see if skill level scores or reading scores are influenced by reading desirability, and if desirability is influenced by the fixed representation or lack thereof of one's own race. Almost done here, last section. Yay. Although black authors have made great strides in literary fiction for young adults, Black Science Fiction Society members still find it difficult to have their work published. Because these genres are becoming popular among young adult readers and are consistently adapted into film, I think it's important to get the writer's perspective about why black invisibility is a fictional norm. The writers who participate in my online interview were asked to elucidate which genres in fiction and film are most receptive to having blacks as major characters. It was a resounding answer with this one: comedy, 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 comedy. One writer in particular does say this: comedy is more accepting because these are not serious roles. The protagonists in these films are non-threatening. Another says that it's all right for a black man to act a fool and tickle the sensibilities of the masses, but for him to be crowned king, like in the third installment of Lord of the Rings, is somehow unbelievable for larger audiences. Indeed, the male protagonists of black sci-fi writers have never received the same level of attention as Medea, Shanae, Dr. Faye Harrison, the author of Transforming Anthropology and the renowned editor of the anthology Decolonizing Anthropology, says that we must decolonize the production and dissemination of media representations. Although this question was posed to fellow anthropologists, I extend it to all of you that came to hear us speak today. Why should we decolonize such representations and how they are dispensed to the public? I argue that we should seek to make visible the black body in fiction and film, not only as a fractured body, an incomplete body, a subservient body, but a body that is whole, complex, and capable of more than just following, but possesses the necessary ability to lead. Black characters and who they represent deserve to be more than just a sidekick or servant to white characters. How marketable they are, how universal they are, I think says less about them and more about the audience that embraces or rejects them. One writer wrote this to me: I think black characters can be universal. Whether people across the world want them to is a different story. People look at black people and automatically assume from skin color alone that they can't relate. I'm not sure people can get beyond that, end quote. Perhaps that was what my little mentee felt the day I handed her this book, which I thought was a really good book. Maybe she felt that way. Maybe she felt she couldn't relate to the girl in this story because the girl was a white chick, you know? But I believe that this could change, but I asked the question how and why. I believe children cannot fully appreciate the culture of another if they do not first know their own. They cannot see the beauty in another if they don't recognize the beauty within themselves. They cannot fully know the story of someone if they do not know theirs. Writers can use the stroke of their pens, parents can use their wallets, ethnographers can use themselves to explore the issue firsthand through participant observation, but without the cooperation of publishing and film companies, among others, Black children will only see a fractured, incomplete, subservient, oppressed self in such industries if they ever see themselves at all. If we see so far, we'll only go so far. One of the women that I interviewed said this to me, one of the mothers. Perhaps if the bookstore I went to a few years ago had a children's section with some brown faces gracing the covers about vampires, witches, sorcerers, warlocks, pirates, what have you, then a different book might have been purchased that day. Perhaps my mentee would have seen a face like hers and looked beyond the cover to explore a world filled with endless possibilities that she herself very much deserves. Thank you. Hi guys, I hope you all enjoyed my video. Take care, stay blessed, and as always, tell your story, no one else will. Peace.